Hey everybody out there in YouTube land, it's Logan Albright back with another book review for you this fine week. I hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk about Warlock by Oakley Hall. What? Oh, yeah, I did get a haircut. Thanks for noticing. Today I want to talk about Warlock by Oakley Hall. This was published in 1958 and it's a Western, which is weird for me because I'm not a Western guy. I don't read Westerns, I don't like Westerns, but I like this book and I'm going to tell you why. The only two Westerns I've ever really liked are Lonesome Dove, which is excellent, and you should read it if you haven't. Go stop watching this video and go read Lonesome Dove. But if you have read that one, Warlock is a different take on the Western that I think is quite refreshing. Now, I'm having a little bit of difficulty explaining why I like it. It's sort of a transition from the old way of telling Western stories to a newer way. If you think of like old black and white Gary Cooper movies with the white hats and the black hats and the good guys and the bad guys, very simplistic, very romantic stories about the West. Those were great for what they were, but there was a transition kind of from horse operas to a more realistic West, which is portrayed in Warlock. Now, I know in my last video, I went on at length about how I prefer the romantic in literature to the realistic, and I find the depiction of everyday life sort of boring and humdrum, and I like big characters and big stories, and I like romanticism. So it may seem odd that I like this book, which is really just the tale of a small town called Warlock in the Wild West, and the characters that live in that town and the things that happen to them. It's sort of an ensemble. There's no real one main character. There's lots of different people. There's no central conflict in the book. There's lots of little mini conflicts and things that go on in everyday life. So I may seem to be contradicting myself here and saying that I like something more realistic rather than something romantic. But I think of it not so much as a transition to realism as it is a transition to a different kind of romanticism. And I think it's analogous to what you see happening in film with Westerns, where you have, like I said, the black and white Gary Cooper movies, black hats, white hats, transitioning into the spaghetti Westerns in the 1960s, 1970s period. Much more colorful, much more violent, much more dangerous, much more nuanced. And in a way, they're more realistic, but in a way, they're more stylized as well. I think, the Clint Eastwood spaghetti Westerns, things like Once Upon a Time in the West or A Fistful of Dollars, those are not realistic movies. They seem grittier, and so they seem more real because they're darker. But in fact, it's a different kind of romanticism. It just portrays a different aspect of the West where it's a little bit more dangerous. The threat is a little bit more real. And I kind of think it's a little bit like the pulp novels of the 20s and 30s, things like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler's novels, which I've talked about before. Warlock does remind me of a Dashiell Hammett book. It's kind of violent, it's kind of dark, but there are definitely larger-than-life conflicts in it, and there are unrealistic but real situations all the same. I was just watching this Orson Welles interview where he was talking about James Cagney, and he was explaining the difference between real and true in cinema. So he was talking about how James Cagney had a totally unrealistic stylized performance, but there was truth in everything that he portrayed. And I feel like that's the case with Warlock. It's a little bit stylized. It's not really how things would have happened, but it tells a true story of the Wild West, and I think it's good for that. And it's definitely refreshing as a different type of story, a different type of Western story, I should say, because we get tired of the same old horse operas. We get tired of the same old cowboys and Indians kind of stories. I thought Lonesome Dove was great because of its scope and its epicness and its the clarity of the characters, the immense depth of those characters and how likable and relatable they were. Warlock I like for a different reason. I think it does a great job of creating a sense of time and place. It really brings you to that town in that period of time in the American West, and it's not so epic, but it's not small either. I wouldn't say it tries to minimize the struggles of these characters. It shows you kind of just in stark relief how brutal it could be out there. I want to bring up another example. It's a recent film called The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which is directed by the Coen brothers. And it's a series of vignettes that, in my opinion, were an attempt to de-romanticize the West, to show it as much more brutal, realist terms than what you usually see in Western movies. And it was done kind of satirically. I didn't actually care for the movie because I kind of resent efforts to de-romanticize things that I consider fundamentally romantic. And again, here it sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but I do think there's a distinction to be made between the kind of romanticism that is a little bit more violent and a little bit more dangerous and a little bit more present, and this stark realism that is just small and gritty and everyday and not that interesting to me. It's mundane. there's nothing in Warlock that's mundane. Things seem more everyday, they seem more believable, but they're not mundane. These are big events, and they're exciting events, and they're characters you care about. And I think it does a really good job of kind of walking that line, that balance between romanticism and realism, where it brings you into this situation, it brings you into this time and place where it's a foreign time and place, right? You know, even with us Americans, you know, people might be watching from all over the world, but in America, you grow up with this mythology of the West, and even if you live you know, on the East Coast, or if you live on the West Coast, there's a foreignness to it. It doesn't feel like your home. It doesn't feel like the place that you're familiar with. So you're already entering alien territory in that regard. So that's already kind of romantic. So it brings you, and then it's another time as well, obviously, right? There's technologies in a different state, laws are in a different state, governments in a different state, more social mores are in a different state. So you're brought into this foreign world, and you're trying to learn about the realm. It's almost a science fiction kind of story in that regard. Because it's just so foreign to our experience. And I think there's something fundamentally romantic about that. And that's what I like about it. And I don't think that it accomplishes the kind of literary realism that I've been complaining about in the last couple of videos, where the characters are just, you know, normal people, everyday people that you might meet in your real life. I don't think you'd meet these people in your real life. I don't think you'd experience these events in your real life, which means that it's something worth writing about and worth talking about. So if you're like me, if you're not that much of a fan of Westerns, but if you're interested in exploring the genre, my recommendations would be first read Lonesome Dove, which is epic and beautiful and has wonderful characters and will really get you emotionally involved. And then second, read Warlock, which is a very different take, but I think a useful and a contrasting take on the West. I also like this edition. It's by a New York Review of Books, and it's a paperback, which I usually prefer hardbacks, but it's kind of a sturdy paperback, and I like the colors on it. Look at the beautiful green and yellow and orange. It kind of says Warlock to me. It's a great title. It's very evocative, so I like that about it. So there you go. That's my take on Westerns and Warlock specifically by Oakley Hall. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you like to see more of my videos, feel free to subscribe and click the notifications bell. And please leave me comments in the description if you want to recommend books for me to read, if you have comments on this book or other books that are like it. And I'll catch you next time. Thanks so much for watching.